Today we're going to start working on our second weapon, the bow. Unlike the sword that has 3 attacks occurring in succession, the bow only has a single attack. And also, instead of the entire attack being triggered by a single button press, the bow requires input to be held down to fully draw the bow, and then the input to be released to actually fire the bow. So in this video, we're going to look at how the animator for the bow is structured, and adjust our WeaponSprite component to accommodate attack animations that are made up of more than just a single clip and has potentially different paths. So welcome to Bardent, my name is Heinrich, and this is part 16 of the multi-weapon system series. The first thing I want to do is import our weapon sprites and just do all the processing that we need to do on that. So there will be a link in the description where you can download these assets, and then we can just go ahead and come to our sprites folder, player, combat, and in here you can see we already have a sword folder that we created for our sword sprites. So just in the combat parent folder, go ahead and create a new folder called bow, open that up, and let's just go ahead and drag and drop in our new sprites. So there will be 4 sprite sheets: bow, which is the base character animation, and then 3 separate bows. Now let's quickly go ahead and do some processing on these. So just go ahead and select all of them. For sprite mode, we want to go ahead and select multiple. The pixels per unit is 16, and we want to set our filter mode to point no filter. And then finally, compression goes from normal quality to none. Go ahead and hit apply, and now we're ready to slice these sprites. So unfortunately, we can't do all of them at once, so we'll have to do them one by one. But essentially, we'll start with bow, come to sprite editor, over here hit slice, and then change the type from automatic to grid by cell size, and the cell size is 64 by 64. Go ahead and hit slice and then apply, and then repeat for the other sprite sheets. Just like that. Okay, now because we are working with a new weapon, that means we can no longer use the same animator as our sword. So each one of our weapon types is going to have its own animator. So in our animations folder, come to animator controllers, player, combat, and in here you'll see we have the sword base weapon AC. So in this folder, right click, create a new animator controller. This is going to be the bow _ base weapon AC. Now for us to be able to work with this animator, we're going to have to assign it to one of our weapons. So let's head over to our hierarchy, come to our player, and let's just open up the primary weapon and come to the base game object. In here, we can then select our bow base weapon AC on our animator. So now if we have the base game object selected and we come to our animator window, we should be able to edit this animator. Now maybe you can already notice a problem here. We've changed our animator controller for our base on the primary weapon, but the primary weapon has sword 1 weapon data assigned to it. So you are correct in thinking that if we were to run the game now and we try to attack, we're going to get an error. And that's because our weapon data and our animator no longer match up. So what we're going to do quickly is we need to add our animator as part of our weapon data so that we can assign that animator in our data asset over here. And then when the weapon is generated, we can assign that animator. So let's go ahead and come to our IDE. And I forgot to hide my taskbar again. Give me one sec. There we go. I just like my videos better if we can't see that. So let's go ahead and come to our IDE. And then in the File Explorer, let's go ahead and look for our scriptable objects, WeaponDataSO. So this is the scriptable object that we generate our weapon data asset from. So let's go ahead and add a new field in here that's going to store our animator. So just above public int number of attacks, I'm going to create a new field, serialize field, with a public runtime animator controller. So that's just the type used to store that animator controller file. And I'm just going to call it animator controller. And then don't forget to give it a public getter and a private setter. So now our weapon asset should be able to reference the correct animator controller. Next, we need to go ahead and set that animator controller to our base animator. And we're going to do that in our weapon generator script. So over here in weapons, we can find weapon generator, and we have this function called generate weapon that just takes care of a whole bunch of stuff. At the very end of that, we're going to set this animator. Now the first thing we need is a reference to the animator. So let's come back up to the top, and just underneath all my variables, I'm going to declare a private animator called anim. And then in the start function, before we generate the weapon, because we need a reference to this animator for that. So in here, we can just say anim equals get component in children. And the type that we're looking for is animator. So remember that weapon generator sits on the parent weapon game object, whereas base is a child of that parent. So this should be able to find it. And of course, we can't have more than one animator as children if we want this to work. So if your weapon is set up differently, just make sure you take that into account. But so now with a reference to this animator set, that means we can come to the end of the generate weapon function. And over here, we can say anim.runtime animator controller equals data.animator controller. If we go ahead and save this and then come back to Unity, when we run the game now, even though our primary weapon has the sword 1 data and our base has the bow animator, it should work, except not really because we haven't set the data yet. So back in the project tab, come to sword 1 and sword 2, and for animator controller, select the sword base weapon AC. So now with that done, if we run the game and we attack, you can see that our primary attack both still work. Perfect. So that's one thing out of the way. Now the next little piece of housekeeping we want to take care of is we want to create a data file for our bow. So in this data folder, go ahead and right click, hit create, data, weapon data, basic weapon data. And in here we can just say bow_1. And then for animator controller, I'm going to select the bow base weapon AC. So now we should be able to assign this to our primary weapon. So come to primary weapon, instead of sword 1, hit bow 1. Okay, so currently our bow is just a weapon that does nothing. It doesn't have any components assigned to it yet, and its animator is also completely empty. So this is a good time to talk about the structure of a bow's attack and how its animator is set up. So like I mentioned in the intro, the bow, instead of having 3 separate attacks like the sword, if we were to take a look at the secondary weapon instead, so over here, our sword is made up of 3 attack animations that happen in succession. The bow, on the other hand, is going to be a single attack where that single attack is made up of multiple animations. And it is made up of multiple animations because we want to be able to draw back the bow and hold it as long as we want before releasing the arrow. So that means our attack is broken up into 3 separate phases. We have the anticipation phase, where we draw the bow back. We have the idle phase, where we're holding the bow fully drawn and we're waiting to fire. And then we have the action phase, where we release the arrow and we can see the bow firing. So let's quickly go ahead and set that up. Select the base game object of the primary weapon, or whichever one you assigned that animator to. And in here, with this selected, we can come to this animation window and hit create a new clip. So this is going to try and put this in our data folder, which I think is just the last folder we had open in the project window. So go ahead and head back to assets, animation, animations, player, combat. And in here we have a folder for our sword. So just go ahead and hit new folder and call it bow. Now in this folder, the first animation is going to be called bow_anticipation. Like that. So that's the first animation. Let's go ahead and create another one. This is going to be bow_idle. And then finally, the third one is going to be bow_action. And then finally, just like our sword, which has this empty animation, we need to add that. So we can get that from our project animations folder. There's this empty animation right there that is just multi-use. Go ahead and add that in there. And then right click on empty and say set as layer default state. Now again, just like our sword animator, we need to go ahead and add our parameters. So the first parameter we have is our Boolean that is called active. The other parameter we're going to add for now is the counter, which even though we're not using it, counter is part of the base weapon script, so it's still going to try and set this counter, and we don't want to get any warnings from it constantly. So just go ahead and hit the counter. It's okay if we don't use it. Now, in terms of transitions, let's go ahead and set this up to look a little bit nicer. The first thing I'm going to do is transition from entry down to anticipation. So right click on entry, make transition to bow anticipation, select this transition, and now for conditions, we want to set active must be true. We then have a transition from anticipation to idle. And for this transition, instead of having a condition, we're going to set the exit time to 1. So once the anticipation animation has finished playing, we're going to transition to here, and we want to set the transition duration to 0 because we want it to happen instantly. Next, we're going to have a transition from our bow idle to bow action. And for this, we would have a condition that is hold must be false. So we're going to have a new parameter called hold. Let's just go ahead and add that. So it's another Boolean. And we want to set this condition equals to hold must be false. And then we can untick has exit time, and the transition duration is also 0. Next, we have a transition from bow action to exit. And in this case, we want to set has exit time to false, transition duration to 0, and the condition is that active must be false. The final transition we need is from empty to exit. And this transition has no exit time, and the transition duration is 0, and the condition is active must be true. And that's just how our animator is set up. Now in this episode, we're not going to focus on the component that sets this hold parameter to true. It'll just remain false for now. So why am I talking so much about attack phases, and why do we need to care about it? Well, let's think about how our weapon is currently set up, namely how we display our weapon sprites. So if you remember correctly, this animator for a weapon is simply responsible for displaying the base animation for a weapon. So the animation of the player using the weapon and not the actual weapon sprite itself. That's the whole point of this system. Now, how we currently have it set up is one of our components, which is this weapon sprite component, simply has an array of sprites that store the sprites for each one of the frames of an attack animation. And we listen to hear when our base frame changes, and then we update our weapon sprite. But now, when we have an animation that can loop, we run into an issue. If we have a single array storing all the sprites for the weapon, how do we know when a sprite change means go back to a previous sprite instead of going to the next one? And that's where these phases are going to come in. So instead of having a single array of sprites for a weapon, we're going to have an array of groups of sprites, where each group of sprites, which again would just be another array of sprites, corresponds to a particular weapon phase. So when we get to an end of one of those groups of sprites and the weapon phase doesn't change, that means we just simply loop back to the first sprite in that group. I hope that makes sense. If not, let's jump into the code, and hopefully by the end it will. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define this concept of our attack phases, and we're going to do that with an enum. So back in our weapons folder, I'm just going to add a new C# class, and I'm going to call it AttackPhases. And here, just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to select enum so that it is generated as a public enum attack phases. Now, throughout the series, we're going to be adding a couple more phases in here, but for now, we only have 3. The first one is going to be anticipation. The second one is idle. And the third one is action. Now, the reason we declared this as an enum is because we're going to create an animation event that passes this enum through to our weapon to tell it, hey, I just entered this phase. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's come to our animation event handler class, and let's create a new trigger. This is going to be private void enter attack phase. And this function is actually going to have an input parameter this time that has the type AttackPhases that we just created called phase. And when this happens, we're going to invoke an event. We haven't created it yet, but this event's going to be called on enter attack phase question mark dot invoke and pass through this phase. Then let's come up to our events and say public event action. And now instead of being just action like before, we're going to use this generic version and we're going to say attack phases is the type of the input parameter. And then we're going to call it on enter attack phase. And that's our event handler setup. And we'll talk about how we're going to use this in our WeaponSprite component in just a second. For now, let's head back to Unity and let's quickly finish setting up these animations. We haven't added any of the frames yet. So I'm going to hit bow anticipation. Well, actually, no, I'm going to come to my hierarchy, select my base game object in the primary weapon, and then in the animation window down here, I'm going to select bow anticipation. I'm going to set my sample rate to 15, and then I'm going to come to my project window over here, which for now I'm just going to drag down here like this. I'm then going to come down to my sprites folder, where I added the sprites earlier, and expand the bow sprites. Now my bow animation is really simple and probably could use a bunch of frames in between, but it does what it needs to do. So for anticipation, that is only the first 2 frames. Now just to make it look a little bit better, I'm going to drag the second frame about 2 across like that. So this is the anticipation animation for the bow. Next I'm going to come to bow idle, and the idle animation is just the second frame over and over. I'm still going to set the sample rate to 15, just in case we ever add new frames here later, but it's just a single frame. Finally, I'm going to come to bow action, and that is the final 4 frames. So go ahead and drag those in, set the sample rate to 15, and just like the sword, I'm going to select the last 3 frames and just move them 1 over, so there's a little delay after the character releases the arrow before it returns back to idle. And then at the very last frame, I'm going to add an animation event, and this is the animation finished trigger, just so that our weapon can update the state machine and we can actually leave the attack. Now with all this added, we should actually be able to test the game. If we run it, and we try to use our primary attack, you'll see the character draws the bow and fires. No problem. Next, let's go ahead and add in that new animation event that we just created. So back to our bow anticipation animation, which is the first one. In the very first frame, we're going to add a new animation event. And then in the inspector, we can select a function from the dropdown, the enter attack phase. And you can see here now in the brackets, it has this attack phases. If we select that, we now get this dropdown where we can select something from that enum. So because this is the anticipation animation, we're going to select anticipation. Next, we can come to our idle animation, do the same thing, add a frame, enter attack phase, idle. And then finally, bow action, first frame, add a new animation event, enter attack phase, action. And now let's also just go ahead and do the same thing for the sword animations that we already created. Now, our swords again are made up of just a single animation, and I prefer to just call this the action phase because the entire thing is just the action. So for sword attack 1, on the first frame, add a new animation event, select enter attack phase, action, and then do the same thing for the other 2. Cool, so we are now ready to update our WeaponSprite component to make use of these attack phases. So back in our IDE, let's go ahead and take a look at our WeaponSprite component again. So over here, we have this function called handleBaseSpriteChange. This is responsible for updating our weapon sprite whenever the base sprite changes. So you can see over here we have a reference to an array of sprites for our current attack data. And then here we simply set our sprite renderer sprite to something from that list based on some index. So here's the part where we're going to want to make some changes. Instead of getting this entire array of sprites, we need to get an array of sprites from a particular section based on the current phase. And this is going to require us to update the definition for the WeaponSprite component data. So let's go ahead and open up this component data folder and then attack data. And let's come to attack sprites. So in here, this is an array of sprites for a single attack. Underneath this class, let's go ahead and declare a new public struct called phase sprites. And all this is it is going to be our array of sprites, but it also holds another field, serialize field, public attack phases enum called phase. So now we have an object that associates a specific phase with a specific array of sprites. And back in our attack sprites class, instead of an array of sprites, we're going to have a new field, serialize field, public phase sprites array called phase sprites with a public getter and a private setter. So now the data for this component is an array of these things. So we're going to have multiple of these per attack, where each one of those has a single phase associated with it and an entire array of sprites for that phase. I hope this is making sense so far. So that means we need to come back to our WeaponSprite component, and we'll have to make a couple of changes in here. Now the first thing we want to do is we're going to want to listen for that event that we just added to all of our animations, the phase change event. So above this handle base sprite change function, I'm going to create a new private void function called handle enter attack phase. And this is going to have an input parameter of attack phases called phase. I'm then going to come down to my start function. And in here, after I register the sprite change callback function, I'm going to say event handler, which we have access to through our base class, dot on enter attack phase plus equals handle enter attack phase, the function we just created. We can then copy and paste this in our onDestroy function and change the plus equals to minus equals. So now whenever that animation event happens, we're going to call this function. Here, the first thing I want to do is reset the index that we're using to choose which sprite to display. So I'm going to say current weapon sprite index equals 0. Next, I want to set the array of sprites that we're working off of. So I'm actually going to come up to my variables, and underneath the sprite index, I'm going to declare a private sprite array called current phase sprites. Back in this handle enter attack phase function, I'm then going to say current phase sprites equals current attack data dot phase sprites, which is that new array that we just created, dot first or default. And then to this link statement, I'm going to pass data arrow function data dot phase equals the phase that we just passed into this function. And then finally, I'm going to say dot sprites. So here we're looking at the current attack data, which is going to refer to that object that holds the array of phase sprites. So we then access that dot phase sprites, which is an array. So we're going to look through this entire array for the first item that matches this condition. And the condition is that the phase of that item is the same as the phase that we're passing through here. So once we have that object, we can then access its sprites array. So we're setting the current phase sprites equal to the sprites array of the object that has the same phase as the animation that we just entered. So with that done, that means we can come to our handle base sprite change function. And in here, we can completely remove this current attack sprites equals current attack data.sprites line, because instead of using current attack sprites, we're going to use current phase sprites over there and over here. And that should be all the changes that we needed to make to our WeaponSprite component. So that means we can now come back to Unity and we'll have to fix a couple of things. Because we made the changes to our attack sprite data class, that means the places where we've already used it are now broken. So if we come to our project, come to the data folder and just look at sort 1, where we have this weapon sprite data, you can see we have attack 1, attack 2, attack 3, but there's nothing there. Now actually one thing we do need to do, come back to our editor, come back to the attack sprite class, is we need to mark this struct as serializable so that it shows up in the inspector. And back in Unity again, if we select sort 1, you can see we now have attack 1 with this phase sprites item, but there's nothing in any of these. So we're going to have to add it. So let's quickly fix our swords just to make sure everything's working, and then we can go and do the same thing for our bow. So in sword 1, we still have these 3 attacks. And because each attack is only a single animation, that means we only need 1 item here. You can see here now we can select the phase that this corresponds to. So we're going to choose action, and then we can add our sprites again. So come back to the hierarchy, lock the inspector. Wait, no. We want to stay in project, come down to our sprites folder, and we want the sword folder. And this is sword 1, so expand sword 1. And there's 15 sprites, so we want the first 5 for the first attack. Load that in there. Then come to attack 2, add 1, change the phase to action, and add the next 5 sprites, like that. And then finally attack 3, it is also action, and the final 5 sprites. Just like that. We can go ahead and do the same thing for our sword 2. So weapon sprite, all of these are broken. Set the number of attacks so we only have these first 2 to worry about. Add the first set of sprites, phases again action, come back to our sprites folder, close sword 1 and expand sword 2, and we want the first 5 frames for these sprites, and then for attack 2, add a new phase, change this to action, and the next 5 sprites. So again, it might not seem like we've done anything because it essentially remained the same on our swords, but you'll see how this becomes useful for our bow. But for now, let's just go ahead and run the game and make sure everything still works. So the bow, still nothing happens obviously because we haven't added the sprites, but our sword 2 works perfectly. And if we just go ahead and change our primary weapon back to sword 1 and run the game again, it still works. Perfect. So let's go ahead and add our bow sprites. So back in the project window, come to data, bow 1, let's lock this, and let's add our weapon sprite component. Now our number of attacks is 1, so let's hit that and say set number of attacks. And now our bow has 3 phases, so let's just go ahead and add 3 elements to this array. Now the first one is going to be anticipation, so I'll just leave it like that. The next one is idle, and then the final one is our action phase. So with those set, let's come to our sprites, come to bow 1, and the anticipation is the first 2 frames, so add that to our sprites. The idle is just our second frame, so add that there. And then finally, action is our last 4. So select those and drag them in there. So now, if we come back to primary weapon, set the data to bow 1, and then run the game. There we go. It works. And so yeah, that is the introduction to our bow. Now, it might not seem like we've done a lot, but this is an important step towards being able to support a lot more of the different weapon types that I have planned, like the magic that has a bunch of different paths that the animation could take, because the attack could get cancelled, it could get interrupted, things like that. So we needed our components to be able to handle our animations having different paths. In the next episode, we'll probably start taking a look at projectiles again and creating the arrow for the bow to fire, before moving on to actually working on the draw mechanic for the bow and having that affect how far the arrow will travel. But that's going to do it for this episode. If you would like early access to the prototype that I'm using for the series, it is available over on Patreon to all of my patrons. And with that being said, I would just like to say thank you to all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon, and a huge special thank you to Cody Lee, SM, Madger Sins, Jake Skarupa, Patrick, Atami, Mike Rodriguez, Nathan Ackley, and Nathalion Killeren. You guys are absolute mad lads, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.